You know what really messes with my head? The idea that the greatest race car ever built might be one you've never even heard of. Not because it cheated. Not because it was controversial. But because it was so impossibly, terrifyingly good that the entire racing series it was built for got cancelled before it ever turned a competitive wheel. That's not a story about failure. That's a story about being too right too early in a world that wasn't ready for you. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about banned and forgotten race cars that rewrote the rules of what was possible. If you're someone who geeks out over the engineering that never got its moment, the mechanical masterpieces that history forgot, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now look, before we get into this, I want you to understand the context here, because without context, the Toyota TA22D just sounds like another fast car with a sad story. But with context, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a parable about ambition, about engineering without limits, and about what happens when the humans controlling the machinery finally admit that maybe, just maybe, they've gone too far. And to understand why that matters, we need to go back to 1986, to a moment in motorsport that changed everything, not because of what happened on the stages, but because of what happened off them. Group B was, depending on who you ask, either the greatest or the most irresponsible era in rally history. Probably both simultaneously. The FIA had essentially told manufacturers in the early 1980s, build whatever you want, put whatever engine you want in it, make it as powerful as you can, and if spectators want to stand 3 feet from the road while 500 horsepower missiles fly past at 120 miles per hour, well, that's their problem. And for a few glorious, terrifying years, the manufacturers absolutely delivered. Lancia built the Delta S4, a twin-charged monster running both a turbocharger and a supercharger simultaneously, producing somewhere north of 480 horsepower in road trim and considerably more in competition spec. Audi unleashed the Sport Quattro S1, a car so violent that even its own drivers occasionally described it as trying to kill them. Peugeot showed up with the 205 T16, a mid-engine all-wheel drive weapon that looked like a hot hatch and drove like something that escaped from a government weapons program. Here's what most people don't realize about Group B though. As spectacular as those cars were, they were just the opening act. The FIA had already been working on what came next. Group S. And Group S made Group B look like a Sunday morning drive. The regulations, such as they were, essentially said that manufacturers needed to build just 10 road cars to homologate a race car, down from the 200 required for Group B. The power limits were essentially non-existent. The weight minimums were a suggestion more than a rule. The FIA was, in retrospect, building the most dangerous racing series ever conceived, and they were doing it deliberately, enthusiastically, and with considerable excitement. Toyota got the memo. And unlike some of their competitors who were still figuring out what Group S might mean, Toyota decided to treat it as a complete blank canvas. Not an evolution of what they had, not a refinement of the Celica twin-cam turbo that had been competing in Group B with respectable but never dominant results. A completely, radically, uncompromisingly new machine. So they sat down in their Toyota Team Europe facility in Cologne, Germany, and someone in that room said something to the effect of, "If we're going to do this, let's actually do this." And what followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering programs in motorsport history, conducted in near total secrecy, that produced a car so advanced it frightened the people who built it. Ove Andersson, the Swedish rally legend who ran Toyota Team Europe, was the man overseeing this madness. And when I say he took security seriously, I mean reportedly Cold War levels of compartmentalization. Engineers working on the suspension had no idea what the engineers working on the engine were doing. The people developing the aerodynamics didn't know the final weight distribution target. It was like building a weapons system, except the weapon was designed to win rallies rather than start wars, which, given Group B's casualty list, might be a distinction without a difference. The complete blueprints were kept in a two-key safe. One key stayed with Anderson in Germany. The other was held in Japan. You either think that's brilliant operational security or a deeply troubling indicator of trust issues. It's probably both, honestly. What they created, when you finally see it described in full, defies every convention of what rally cars were supposed to be in 1986. Let's start with the engine, because the engine is where this story immediately goes sideways in the best possible way. Toyota took their 503E four-cylinder unit, a distant, unrecognizable cousin of the kind of engine you might find in a sensible family saloon, and did genuinely unspeakable things to it. 2 liters of displacement. A turbocharger the size of a small watermelon from KKK, which is a turbo manufacturer and not something else, I promise. Titanium connecting rods. Forged pistons that cost more per unit than most people's mortgage payment. A crankshaft machined to tolerances so fine that they make Swiss watchmaking look sloppy. The compression ratio was aggressive enough to make a diesel engineer uncomfortable. And at the end of all this beautiful mechanical violence, you got somewhere in the region of 600 horsepower, screaming through a rev range that stretched to 8,000 revolutions per minute. In 1986, from a four-cylinder engine, in a car built to go sideways on gravel roads at triple-digit speed. For comparison, the Audi Sport Quattro S1 that was terrorizing Group B at the same time made around 500 horsepower and was considered borderline undrivable by several of its own factory pilots. Toyota was planning to show up with 600. And here's the genuinely insane part. The power delivery was supposed to be linear. Not the savage, unpredictable surge of turbo power that made Group B cars so terrifying, but something smooth, consistent, manageable. Toyota achieved this through what can only honestly be described as mechanical witchcraft. Variable boost pressure that changed dynamically based on what gear you were in, where the throttle was positioned, what angle the steering was at, and probably a few other variables that even the engineers struggled to fully articulate. The ECU controlling all of this, and remember this is 1986 when most automotive computers had approximately the processing power of a digital watch, somehow managed to coordinate all of these variables in real time to keep the engine from either producing unmanageable power or turning itself into very expensive confetti. The engine placement was where Toyota really showed the world they weren't playing by anyone else's rules. While Audi was still arguing for front-engine all-wheel drive, and everyone else was doing whatever they could with whatever packaging constraints they'd inherited from their road car programs, Toyota looked at the problem fresh and said, mid-engine. Longitudinal mid-engine, specifically, not transverse like you'd find in a front-wheel drive hatchback turned inside out, but a proper, Ferrari-style longitudinal layout with the engine sitting behind the driver and ahead of the rear axle, feeding power forward and backward through a drivetrain that cost more to develop than some manufacturers spent on their entire motorsport budget. The weight distribution this produced was, on paper, essentially perfect. 48% over the front axle, 52% over the rear. Now look, if you've spent any time around rally cars, you understand why this matters so much. The fundamental problem with going very fast on surfaces that actively hate you, gravel, snow, mud, ice, the kind of surfaces that seem personally offended by the idea of a car traveling across them at speed, is that weight distribution determines everything about how the car rotates, how it puts power down, how it recovers from mistakes, and crucially, how forgiving it is when the driver gets it slightly wrong. Which in rallying, at those speeds, on those surfaces, is constantly. Front-heavy cars understeer. They push wide, they resist rotation, they feel safe right up until they don't. Rear-heavy cars oversteer, they rotate too eagerly, they're dramatic and exciting right up until they're catastrophically upside down. The sweet spot, that magical near-equal distribution, is what every rally car engineer dreams about and almost none of them achieve, because road car platforms don't cooperate, engines are heavy and awkward, and compromises accumulate like debt. Toyota, starting from a blank sheet of paper with unlimited budget and a mandate to build the ultimate rally car, simply decided not to compromise. The 222D's weight distribution wasn't an accident or a happy coincidence. It was an engineering objective pursued with the kind of single-minded determination that makes accountants nervous and engineers legendary. The transmission sitting behind that mid-mounted engine was equally extraordinary. 6 speeds, sequential, with gear ratios spaced so closely together that you could theoretically shift without ever really lifting off the throttle. But the truly remarkable piece wasn't the gearbox itself. It was the center differential. Rally all-wheel drive systems in 1986 were, by modern standards, fairly crude. Fixed torque splits, basic locking differentials, systems that worked well enough but required the driver to anticipate what the car needed rather than the car adapting to what the driver needed. Toyota's solution for the 222D was a center differential that could theoretically vary its torque split from 90% front, 10% rear, all the way to 10% front, 90% rear, and do it in milliseconds. Actual milliseconds. Your brain takes longer to consciously register the word millisecond than this differential took to completely reorganize where it was sending the engine's power. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. It did all of this mechanically, not electronically, not through some computer making thousands of calculations per second, but through a beautifully engineered series of clutch packs and planetary gears that responded to physical inputs, torque loads, wheel speed differences, throttle position, and translated them into mechanical action without waiting for a computer to tell them what to do. This is where it gets really interesting because electronic systems fail. Software crashes, sensors malfunction, connectors corrode in the rain and mud that rally cars spend their lives bathing in. A mechanical system that can do the same job is not just elegant, it's bulletproof in a way that no electronic system of that era could match. Toyota's engineers had essentially built a brain out of gears and clutches, and it worked faster than any computer they had access to in 1986. The suspension deserves its own dedicated conversation because what Toyota did there borders on prophetic. Double wishbones all the way around, which was sophisticated but not unheard of for the time. The dampers though, those were something else entirely. 3-way adjustable units with remote reservoirs, allowing teams to tune the car's behavior for different surfaces during service stop. Standard exotic rally car stuff for the period. But Toyota added something nobody else was doing. A hydraulic interconnection system linking the suspension corners diagonally across the car. Front left connected to rear right, front right connected to rear left. The practical effect of this was astonishing. When the car hit a bump or a crest or a rut with one corner, the diagonally opposite corner would automatically compensate, preloading itself to maintain the car's attitude and keep all 4 wheels in contact with whatever surface was trying to throw the car into the trees. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds like active suspension, and you'd be almost right. Active suspension, which Williams famously dominated Formula One with in 1992, uses electronic sensors, computers, and hydraulic actuators to read the road and adjust damper rates in real time. Toyota's system achieved a similar result through pure mechanical cleverness, no electronics required, no software to debug, no sensors to fail when they get packed with mud. It was active suspension's smarter, tougher, less fragile older sibling, and Toyota had it running in 1986, 6 years before Williams made the electronic version famous. The fact that this technology essentially disappeared with the 222D when Group S was cancelled is one of motorsport's great engineering tragedies. The body and chassis were pure aerospace thinking applied to a discipline that had historically been more interested in making things strong enough to survive crashes than light enough to defy physics. The entire monocoque, the structural tub that everything else bolted onto and that the driver sat inside, was carbon fiber composite. Not carbon fiber panels bolted to a steel cage, not a steel cage with carbon fiber trim. An actual carbon fiber monocoque, the kind of construction that was considered cutting-edge in Formula One at the time, wrapped in Kevlar body panels that were allegedly capable of stopping small arms fire. Which, given Group B's habit of parking spectators approximately 3 feet from cars traveling at 120 miles per hour, probably wasn't the most absurd engineering requirement anyone had ever specified. The complete body shell weighed less than 200 kilograms. To put that in terms that land with appropriate impact, that is lighter than 2 average adult Americans standing on a scale together. The entire structural and aerodynamic envelope of the car, everything that kept the driver alive and gave the car its shape, weighed less than the 2 people it might theoretically carry. This wasn't weight saving for its own sake, though Toyota engineers did approach it with something close to religious devotion. It was about the power-to-weight ratio. With 600 horsepower pushing something that weighed, fully fueled and crewed, somewhere around 750 kilograms, the 222D was operating in a performance envelope that simply didn't exist in rally racing at that time. You'd have to go to Formula One or prototype endurance racing to find anything comparable, and neither of those categories was being asked to jump over crests and slide through hairpins on loose gravel. The aerodynamics were, to put it diplomatically, ambitious. Toyota's wind tunnel data suggested the 222D would generate actual meaningful downforce at the speeds it would be traveling on rally stages. Downforce. On gravel. On a car that would spend significant portions of its competition life completely airborne, sliding sideways, or both simultaneously. The front splitter was adjustable, allowing crews to tune the aerodynamic balance for different surfaces and different stages. The rear wing was similarly adjustable between competitive stages. And across the underbody, Toyota had installed a series of vortex generators, small aerodynamic devices designed to energize the boundary layer of air flowing under the car and keep it attached to the floor even when the car was at extreme yaw angles. Which in rally, as I've mentioned, is essentially always. Here's what most people don't realize about aerodynamic downforce in rally racing. It's genuinely useful, but almost impossible to harvest consistently. The car is constantly changing angle relative to the road, constantly going over crests that briefly eliminate the ground beneath it, constantly sliding at angles that destroy the carefully calculated airflow your wind tunnel told you to expect. Making aerodynamics work in those conditions requires either extraordinary engineering sophistication or extraordinary optimism. Toyota, characteristically, went with both. Now here's where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating, because we've spent 2 sections talking about what this car was supposed to be, what it was designed to do, what the engineers intended when they were sitting in Cologne dreaming up mechanical nightmares. But at some point, you have to actually build the thing and see if reality cooperates with your ambitions. And with the 222D, reality cooperated in ways that were simultaneously thrilling and deeply alarming to everyone involved. Testing happened in Japan, at a private facility that Toyota controlled, a sealed section of mountain road that the company had somehow acquired access to for exactly this kind of work. The kind of place that doesn't appear on maps, that isn't discussed in press releases, that exists specifically so that engineers can do unreasonable things without an audience. The test driver, whose identity Toyota has never officially confirmed and who has never officially confirmed anything about this program to anyone, was apparently one of the better rally drivers of the era. Someone with enough experience to know what fast felt like and enough technical sophistication to articulate what the car was doing underneath them in terms that engineers could actually use. The reports that have filtered out over the decades, through NDA violations and retirement-loosened tongues and the occasional indiscreet conversation at a motorsport dinner somewhere, paint a picture that sits somewhere between exhilarating and genuinely frightening. The acceleration was described as violent in a way that the word violent doesn't quite capture. This wasn't the aggressive surge of a powerful front-engine car pulling hard against its own weight distribution. This was something more immediate, more complete, more total. 600 horsepower delivered through all four wheels in a car weighing 3/4 of a ton produces acceleration forces that Toyota's own engineers hadn't fully modeled before the first test run. The seats had to be redesigned after the initial sessions because the G-forces under hard acceleration were causing spinal compression in the test driver. Not injury, not damage, just enough sustained force that the driver was measurably shorter after a session than before it. Toyota added a warning light to the dashboard that illuminated when lateral acceleration exceeded 4 Gs, not so the driver could back off, but so the engineers monitoring the telemetry could flag which corners were generating the most extreme load. 4 lateral Gs. For context, a modern Formula One car, with its enormous aerodynamic downforce package and purpose-built racing tires and perfectly smooth circuit surfaces, generates somewhere between 4 and 5 Gs in high-speed corners. The 222D was apparently matching those numbers on loose gravel with 1986 tire technology, in a car that wasn't riding on a smooth asphalt circuit but on a rough mountain road with all the surface consistency of a gravel driveway after a landslide. The telemetry from those test sessions, the actual data recording what the car was doing in measurable, objective terms, remains classified as commercially confidential by Toyota to this day. Someone who definitely did not violate any non-disclosure agreements in speaking with various motorsport journalists over the years suggested that the lateral acceleration figures recorded during those sessions wouldn't be matched by production rally cars for another 2 decades. Let that settle for a moment. 2 decades of development, 2 decades of advances in tire technology, electronics, aerodynamics, materials science, and the understanding of vehicle dynamics, and the 222D was supposedly already there in 1986. Either Toyota had genuinely built something 20 years ahead of its time, or the stories have grown in the telling, as stories about legendary lost machines always do. The honest answer is probably somewhere in between, but the fact that we can't verify it either way because the data is locked in a corporate vault somewhere is exactly the kind of thing that keeps automotive obsessives awake at 2 a.m. The handling characteristics that emerged from testing were apparently where the 222D most dramatically separated itself from everything else that existed. Remember that perfect weight distribution, that mechanical center differential, those hydraulically interconnected dampers? In testing, they combined to produce something that test drivers described with a consistency that suggests they weren't exaggerating. The car could change direction, not rotate gradually like a conventional rally car being coaxed through a corner, but actually instantaneously change direction, with a snap and precision that left tire marks perpendicular to the direction of travel. Not from sliding, which would be expected. From grip. From the mechanical systems generating so much lateral force so quickly that the tires were overwhelmed by traction rather than lack of it. The 222D wasn't sliding through corners because rally cars have to slide. It was occasionally leaving perpendicular marks because it was generating grip faster than rubber on gravel could absorb it. I want to be careful here, because this is the point in stories about legendary lost machines where things tend to drift from documented fact into motorsport mythology. The honest position is that we have fragmentary, unverified accounts of test sessions that covered exactly 11.4 kilometers in total. That's the number that appears consistently across every credible account of the 222D program. 11.4 kilometers. The distance of a slightly ambitious morning run. The distance you might cover on a bicycle in 30 minutes on a Sunday afternoon. Toyota spent an estimated $40 million in 1986 money, which adjusts to somewhere north of $100 million today, developing a rally car that turned a wheel in anger for 11.4 kilometers before the program was frozen forever. Those $40 million bought 6 completed chassis in various states of preparation. 2 were in Europe, having been shipped to Toyota Team Europe in Cologne in anticipation of the car's competition debut. 4 more were in Japan, either complete or in advanced stages of assembly. The European cars were actually loaded into a transporter and on their way to their first competitive event when the news came through. And I want you to really picture this moment because it's one of the more cinematic images in motorsport history, even though it never appeared on film. A transporter carrying two of the most advanced rally cars ever built, somewhere on a German Autobahn, getting a radio call telling them to turn around. The whole program cancelled. Group S cancelled. The series these cars were built for, gone. The transporter executed a U-turn on the Autobahn and drove back to Cologne. Imagine being that driver. Imagine trying to explain what you're carrying and why you're suddenly heading in the opposite direction to where you were going an hour ago. The reason for the cancellation sits at the dark intersection of engineering ambition and human tragedy. 1986 was, by any measure, a catastrophic year for Group B rallying. Henri Toivonen and his co-driver Sergio Cresto died in Corsica when their Lancia Delta S4 went off a cliff at speed and caught fire. The car burned so completely and so quickly that investigators could barely reconstruct what had happened, let alone why. A few events later at the Rally de Portugal, Joaquim Santos lost control of his Ford RS 200 on a stage and drove into a crowd of spectators who were standing, as spectators routinely did in Group B, essentially on the stage itself. 3 people died. 30 were injured. The images were broadcast around the world. The FIA had been aware for some time that Group B was operating at the absolute edge of controllable risk. The speeds were extraordinary, the cars were barely manageable even by the best drivers in the world, and the crowd control at stages in many countries was somewhere between inadequate and non-existent. Spectators would routinely run onto the stage to get a better view of a car that had just passed, unaware that another car was seconds behind it. Marshals were overwhelmed. The combination of 500 horsepower machinery and enthusiastic but dangerously positioned spectators was, in retrospect, an accident waiting to happen. And then it happened. Twice in the same season, in ways that couldn't be explained away or minimized. The FIA's response was decisive. Group B would be cancelled at the end of the 1986 season. And Group S, the even more extreme successor that manufacturers like Toyota had been spending fortunes developing for, Group S would never happen at all. The announcement came with very little warning, which is perhaps understandable given the circumstances but was absolutely devastating for the manufacturers who'd committed enormous resources to building cars for a series that now simply didn't exist. Toyota's executives were, according to every account that has surfaced since, furious. $40 million and years of engineering work had produced the most advanced rally car ever conceived, and it would never race. There were reportedly some extremely tense telephone conversations between Toyota's headquarters in Tokyo and various FIA officials in Paris. One board member allegedly suggested that Toyota should simply enter the 222D in whatever series would accept it, regardless of whether the regulations were remotely appropriate. Cooler heads prevailed, which was probably wise, because the insurance implications alone would have been financially ruinous. Here's the thing about the cancellation that I think gets missed in most retellings of this story. The FIA wasn't wrong. Given what Group B had demonstrated about the gap between what the cars could do and what could be safely managed around them, cancelling Group S was not an overreaction. It was, arguably, one of the more responsible decisions a motorsport governing body has ever made. Group S, with its 10-car homologation requirement and essentially unlimited technical regulations, would have produced cars that made the 222D look restrained. Toyota had spent $40 million to build something with 600 horsepower and revolutionary technology, and they weren't even the most extreme manufacturer working on Group S project. Imagine what that series would have produced by 1988 or 1989. Imagine those cars, with those performance levels, on stages with the same crowd control that had already proven fatal in Group B. The cancellation was the right call. And the 222D was the collateral damage, which is a genuinely tragic thing to say about a piece of engineering that extraordinary, but that's where honesty leads us. But the story doesn't end with a U-turn on the Autobahn and a phone call from Paris, because $40 million worth of engineering doesn't just evaporate when you cancel the program it was built for. Toyota's investment in the 222D produced an extraordinary volume of technological innovation, and while the car itself would never race, the knowledge encoded in its design had to go somewhere. And it did. It went everywhere. Here's what most people don't realize about cancelled motorsport programs. The car might die, but the ideas inside it are immortal. They migrate into other projects, they get adapted for different applications, they solve problems that the engineers didn't even know existed yet. The 222D became, in a very real sense, the seed from which enormous swaths of Toyota's subsequent motorsport success grew, even though Toyota would never publicly acknowledge this in anything more specific than vague corporate platitudes about leveraging experience and building on heritage. The all-wheel drive system, that extraordinary mechanical center differential with its clutch packs and planetary gears and millisecond response times, evolved directly into the system that powered the Celica GT4. Now, the GT4 was a far more conventional car than the 222D. Front engine, based on a production platform, built to group regulations that prioritized reliability and production relevance over outright insanity. But underneath its sensible exterior, the GT4's drivetrain carried the 222D's DNA in unmistakable ways. The torque vectoring principles, the variable split logic, the mechanical solutions to problems that everyone else was trying to solve with increasingly complex electronics, all of it traced back to what Toyota's engineers had learned building a car for a series that never happened. The GT4 went on to win multiple WRC events and the manufacturer's championship. Every time it put power down smoothly on a surface that should have defeated it, every time its drivetrain responded to a sudden loss of traction faster than the driver could consciously react, it was channeling the ghost of a car that had driven exactly 11.4 kilometers in anger. That is one hell of a return on investment for a morning jog's worth of testing. The engine management technology migrated too. Toyota's IMSA GTP program in the late 1980s and early 1990s, running turbocharged engines in closed cockpit prototypes on American road courses, benefited directly from the ECU development that had been conducted for the 222D. The variable boost mapping, the throttle position integration, the altitude compensation algorithms that adjusted fuel delivery based on ambient air pressure, all of it found new homes in racing programs that actually got to compete. The work on turbocharger response and lag reduction, the painstaking development of boost curves that delivered power linearly rather than in the terrifying surge that characterized most turbocharged racing engines of the era, contributed to Toyota's endurance racing efforts in ways that the original engineers might never have anticipated. Even the aerodynamic research, those optimistic but groundbreaking wind tunnel sessions investigating downforce on rally cars, found applications elsewhere. The understanding of airflow management over irregular surfaces at varying yaw angles contributed to the development of the Supra that would go on to dominate the Japanese Grand Touring Championship in the 1990s. JGTC required cars that could produce downforce reliably while following other cars through turbulent air, dealing with drafting effects, and managing aerodynamic balance across a range of speeds and conditions. The 222D's research into maintaining attached airflow while the car was sliding sideways turned out to be remarkably applicable to maintaining attached airflow while the car was driving through another car's dirty wake. So the 222D was dead, but its children were everywhere. And isn't that, in a strange way, the most fitting legacy for a car that was too advanced for its own time? It didn't compete, it didn't win, it didn't collect trophies or set records. Instead, it made everything that came after it better. It was the sacrifice that fed the harvest. Tragic, maybe, but not without meaning. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the program was cancelled and the technology got recycled. What happened to the actual physical cars? And this is where things get genuinely weird, Because the answer depends entirely on who you ask and how much you trust Toyota's official communications, which, on this particular subject, have been consistently and suspiciously vague for nearly 4 decades. Toyota's official position, stated in the rare instances when they've been directly asked, is that the 222D prototypes were disassembled for safety and compliance reasons. Which sounds perfectly reasonable until you start poking at which point it becomes clear that this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Disassembled how? Which components were destroyed and which were retained? Were all 6 chassis treated the same way? Why would a car that was never homologated and never competed need to be disassembled for compliance reasons when there was no regulation requiring its existence or destruction? The unofficial story, the one that circulates in whispers at motorsport events and in the private conversations of people who were involved with Toyota Team Europe during that period, is considerably more interesting. According to these accounts, which I should emphasize Toyota has never confirmed, at least one complete 222D survives intact in a climate-controlled room at Toyota's Cologne facility. Access reportedly requires executive-level approval from Japan. Not from Germany, not from the local facility director, from someone in Toyota City who has the authority to open a door that apparently stays locked for years at a time. Every few years, according to these persistent rumors, the surviving car gets fired up for some internal anniversary or commemoration. Always indoors. Always stationary. Never driven. And the sound, according to the handful of people who claim to have witnessed these private startups, is apparently unlike anything else Toyota has ever produced. 600 horsepower through 4 cylinders and 2 liters, screaming through an exhaust system designed for maximum performance rather than any consideration of noise regulations, produces something that those witnesses consistently describe as closer to a MotoGP motorcycle than a car. A howling, shrieking, mechanical fury that reverberates off the walls of whatever enclosed space is containing it, a sound that was supposed to echo across rally stages from Portugal to Finland and instead echoes across a maintenance bay every few years for an audience that could probably fit in a minivan. And then there are the other stories, the ones that are almost certainly apocryphal but too compelling to completely ignore. Sightings of 222D chassis at private test sessions in Japan. Claims from collectors who insist they've been offered components or even complete cars through back channels. Rumors, and these are my personal favorites, of underground rally events in Japan where forbidden machinery occasionally makes appearances in front of audiences who know better than to bring cameras. These stories are almost certainly nonsense. Almost certainly. But Toyota also denied for years that they were developing a supercar, and then the LFA appeared. They denied that they were returning to top-level endurance racing, and then they showed up at Le Mans with a car that eventually won outright. Toyota has a documented history of publicly denying things that subsequently turn out to be true, which makes their denials regarding the 222D's survival at least marginally less convincing than they might otherwise be. The performance figures that have been attributed to the 222D over the years deserve their own conversation, because they sit in this extraordinary space between plausible and preposterous. 0 to 60 miles per hour in approximately 2.3 seconds. On gravel, a top speed of somewhere around 220 kilometers per hour. On gravel, lateral acceleration capabilities exceeding 2g. On gravel, I keep emphasizing the surface because these numbers would be genuinely impressive for a modern hypercar on racing slicks on smooth tarmac. The 222D was supposedly achieving them on loose surfaces with tire technology that had all the sophistication of a rubber boot compared to modern high-performance compound. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you, because honesty matters more than mythology. Toyota has never officially released performance figures for the 222D. Everything, every number, every statistic, every claimed capability, comes from unofficial sources. Leaked documents, overheard conversations, the educated guesses of engineers who worked on related programs and can extrapolate from what they know about the car's specifications. Some of these numbers may be accurate. Some may be optimistic. Some may be complete fabrications that have been repeated so often they've acquired the weight of fact. We don't know. We can't know. And that uncertainty is simultaneously the most frustrating and the most magical thing about the 222D. The estimated cost per chassis is another number that floats around without official confirmation. $2 million each in 1986 money. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 to $6 million per car in today's terms. For a rally car. Not a Formula One car, not a Le Mans prototype, a rally car. A car designed to be driven on public roads that happen to be closed for an afternoon, through forests and over mountain passes, by two people sitting side by side, one of whom is supposed to be reading pace notes while the car does things to their internal organs that would violate the Geneva Convention. Speaking of the co-driver experience, which nobody ever really talks about in discussions of extreme rally cars, imagine being the person in the passenger seat of a 222D at full attack. Your job is to read from a notebook, calmly and accurately, while the driver beside you deploys 600 horsepower through a mechanical system that responds faster than human reflexes. Your spine is being compressed by acceleration forces that require specially designed seating. The car is changing direction so violently that it's leaving perpendicular tire marks from grip rather than sliding. And you need to communicate upcoming corners, crests, and hazards with enough lead time for the driver to process and respond. Left 3 tightens over crest, 100, right 2 opens into straight. And you're doing this while your body is experiencing forces that fighter pilots train extensively to withstand. The fuel consumption figures round out the portrait of excess beautifully. The 222D's 60-liter fuel cell, mounted directly behind the driver because mid-engine packaging left few other options, would apparently empty itself in less than 12 minutes at full throttle. 12-minute. Modern world rally cars, running considerably less power, can manage roughly twice that duration on a full tank. But then again, modern world rally cars aren't making 600 horsepower from 2 liters, so perhaps the comparison is unfair. The fuel pumps alone could reportedly flow enough fuel to fill a bathtub in under 60 seconds. When your fuel system specifications overlap with industrial pumping equipment, you've probably built something unreasonable. Toyota did not care. The cooling requirements for all of this mechanical fury were, predictably, extraordinary. 3 separate radiators positioned wherever the car's packaging could accommodate them. 2 intercoolers to manage the charge air temperatures generated by that enormous KKK turbocharger. An oil cooler roughly the size of a briefcase, because 600 horsepower generates heat in quantities that would overwhelm a conventional cooling system in minutes. A transmission cooler that wouldn't look out of place bolted to the front of a medium-duty truck. All of this packaged, somehow, into a car with a footprint smaller than a modern Volkswagen Golf. The ducting alone, the network of channels and passages directing cooling air from intakes to heat exchangers and back out again, was a masterpiece of spatial engineering, with air flowing through every available gap and void in the chassis like blood through capillaries. The electronics suite, primitive by any modern standard but revolutionary for 1986, included sensors monitoring wheel speed at all 4 corners, throttle position, boost pressure, suspension travel at each damper, steering angle, brake pressure at each caliper, and ambient air pressure for altitude compensation. All of this data fed into the ECU, which managed the 16 different engine maps that were selectable by the driver through a rotary switch on the dashboard. 16 map. Different boost curves, different ignition timing, different fuel delivery strategies, selectable on the fly while driving at competition speeds on surfaces that would test the concentration of a Buddhist monk. The data logging system that recorded all of this information for post-session analysis was, by the standards of the era, remarkably sophisticated. Toyota called it a black box, which makes it sound like aircraft crash investigation equipment, but it was essentially a hardened tape recorder. Magnetic tape, spinning reels, the kind of technology that belongs in a Cold War submarine drama rather than a rally car. But it worked, and the data it captured during those precious 11.4 kilometers of testing remains locked away in Toyota's archives, presumably gathering dust next to the blueprints and the car itself. The wheels were magnesium. Of course they were magnesium. When you've already committed to building a rally car that costs more than a luxury apartment in Tokyo, material costs for the wheels are essentially a rounding error. These particular magnesium wheels were reportedly so light that a single mechanic could pick one up with one hand and throw it a considerable distance. Not that anyone routinely threw racing wheels across the service park, but the fact that it was physically possible tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Toyota took weight reduction. Every gram mattered. Every component was evaluated not just for its functional contribution but for its mass penalty. If something could be made lighter without compromising its function, it was made lighter. If something couldn't be made lighter, Toyota's engineers would stare at it until they figured out how to make it lighter anyway. The roll cage was constructed from a chromium-molybdenum steel alloy that Toyota had developed specifically for this application. Not sourced from an existing supplier, not adapted from an existing specification, developed from scratch because nothing available met Toyota's requirements for the combination of strength and weight that they demanded. This bespoke alloy was supposedly 30% stronger than conventional T45 steel tubing, while being 20% lighter. The fire suppression system used halon gas, which was already being targeted for phase-out due to its devastating effects on the ozone layer, but which remained the most effective fire suppressant available for enclosed spaces. Even the seat belts were prototype 6-point harnesses that incorporated design features which would later become standard in Formula One safety equipment. Every single component of the 222D's safety system was either bespoke or prototype, developed specifically for this car, contributing to a safety package that was arguably more advanced than what was being used in any other form of motorsport at the time. The adjustable pedal box is one of those details that I find particularly telling about Toyota's engineering philosophy with this project. Not just adjustable for different drivers, which was standard practice, but adjustable during service stops to compensate for brake wear or clutch degradation over the course of an event. The entire pedal assembly sat on precision rails and could be repositioned to preset configurations for each driver, ensuring that pedal feel and ergonomics remained consistent even as the components they controlled wore during competition. Motorized adjustment. On a pedal box. In a rally car. In 1986. This is the kind of detail that reveals the depth of Toyota's commitment to getting absolutely everything right, regardless of cost, complexity, or the basic question of whether anyone actually needed motorized pedal adjustment in a car that would be spending most of its competitive life being thrown sideways through forests. The brakes themselves were carbon-carbon composite units, technology borrowed directly from aerospace applications and barely beginning to appear in Formula One at the time. The operating temperature window for these brakes was extremely narrow compared to conventional steel discs, requiring careful management and specific warm-up procedures before they would function effectively. But within that window, they offered stopping power that was, according to the fragmentary test reports that have emerged, genuinely alarming. The test driver reportedly needed time to acclimatize to braking performance that was so far beyond anything available in contemporary rally cars that their instincts about braking points and stopping distances were completely wrong. They were braking too early, leaving enormous margins, because their experience told them they needed distance that the 222D simply didn't require. This is where it gets really interesting from a human factors perspective, because the 222D presents a fascinating case study in what happens when you build a machine that exceeds the adaptive capacity of the humans who have to operate it. Rally driving is, fundamentally, a learned skill built on thousands of hours of experience that creates intuitive understanding of what a car can and cannot do. Braking points become instinctive. Corner entry speeds are felt rather than calculated. The driver's relationship with the car is built on a mental model that says, at this speed, on this surface, with this much grip, I need to brake here, turn here, accelerate here. The 222D invalidated all of those learned models. Its performance was so far beyond what any rally driver had experienced that their hard-won instincts became actively counterproductive. They were driving defensively in a car that rewarded aggression. They were leaving safety margins in a car that had already engineered its own margins into the chassis. They were, in the most literal sense, not driving the 222D to its potential because they didn't yet know where that potential was. Given more testing time, this problem would presumably have solved itself. Drivers adapt. They recalibrate. They build new mental models. But 11.4 kilometers is not enough distance to recalibrate a lifetime of driving instinct. Which means that even the staggering performance figures attributed to the 222D may represent only a fraction of what the car was actually capable of, because the human operating it hadn't yet learned how to access its full envelope. That thought is either thrilling or terrifying, and I genuinely cannot decide which. The competition preparations that were underway before the cancellation reveal how close the 222D came to actually racing. Toyota had confirmed entries for 3 events. The specific rounds have never been officially identified, but the logistics were in place. Service equipment had been prepared. Spare parts inventories had been established. And most tantalizingly, drivers had been approached. Big names. Names that would have brought immediate credibility and attention to Toyota's Group S program. Walter Röhrl was rumored to have been contacted. Juha Kankkunen, who would go on to win 4 World Rally Championship titles, was reportedly in preliminary contract discussions. Neither Toyota nor either driver has ever confirmed these conversations, but the rumors have persisted with enough consistency and from enough independent sources that there's probably something to them. Imagine that alternate timeline for a moment. Juha Kankkunen, one of the most naturally talented rally drivers who ever lived, behind the wheel of the most advanced rally car ever built, on a competitive stage with championship points on the line. The combination of that driver and that car, given adequate development time and the pressure of actual competition, might have produced performances that would have rewritten what we thought was possible in rallying. Or it might have been a spectacular, expensive disaster, because revolutionary cars frequently are in their early competitive outings. We will simply never know. And that uncertainty, that permanent, unresolvable not knowing, is what elevates the 222D from an interesting historical footnote into something approaching automotive mythology. You can look up the results of any car that actually competed. You can compare lap times, stage times, championship positions. You can assess whether a car lived up to its promise or fell short of its potential. With the 222D, none of that is possible. It exists in a permanent state of ambiguity, simultaneously the greatest rally car ever built and a complete unknown. It is, and I mean this with full awareness of how pretentious it sounds, Schrödinger's race car. Both champion and failure, both vindicated and exposed, until observed in competition. And the box will never be opened. Every few years, the 222D surfaces briefly in popular culture. A racing video game will include it as unlockable content, recreated from whatever specifications the developers could piece together from published sources and educated speculation. Sim racers will then spend months arguing about whether the virtual version is overpowered or accurate, as though anyone alive actually knows the answer to that question. It appears in magazine retrospectives and YouTube documentaries, always accompanied by the same handful of grainy photographs that represent essentially the entire visual record of the car's existence. Modern Toyota executives get asked about the 222D occasionally, usually at motorsport events where the combination of champagne and nostalgia loosens corporate discipline just enough for the question to be posed directly. The answer is always some variation of the same carefully constructed non-response. We value our heritage, we're focused on the future, we're proud of everything our engineers have achieved across all programs. Diplomatic, professional, and absolutely devoid of any actual information. But then Toyota will announce something like the GR Yaris, a homologation special built in limited numbers with a turbocharged 3-cylinder engine producing far more power than any reasonable hatchback needs, paired with an all-wheel drive system of unusual sophistication, and you can see it. That same engineering insanity, that same willingness to build something unreasonable simply because the capability exists to do so. The 222D's spirit didn't die when Group S was cancelled. It went dormant, hibernating inside Toyota's engineering culture, waking up periodically to produce cars that make accountants nervous and enthusiasts grateful. The GR010 hybrid that won Le Mans carries echoes of the same philosophy. Extraordinary technology deployed without compromise in pursuit of a single objective. The GR Corolla, a car that nobody asked for and everybody wanted, exists because someone at Toyota remembered what it felt like to build something that exceeded reasonable expectations. These are the 222D's children, not in terms of shared components or direct technological lineage, but in terms of the attitude that produced them. The belief that if you're going to build something, you should build it properly, which at Toyota apparently means building it to a standard that makes everyone slightly uncomfortable. The broader legacy of the 222D extends beyond Toyota, though, into a conversation about motorsport philosophy that remains relevant today. Every generation of racing produces at least one car that's too good for its own context. The Chaparral 2J, with its auxiliary engine driving vacuum fans that sucked the car to the track surface, was banned from Can-Am racing in 1970 not because it broke any existing rules but because it rendered competition meaningless. The Brabham BT46B fan car won its only Formula One race in 1978 by such a margin that Gordon Murray withdrew it voluntarily before the governing body could react. The Williams FW14B dominated the 1992 Formula One season so comprehensively with its active suspension and traction control that the FIA banned both technologies for the following year. These cars occupy a specific and honored place in motorsport history. They are the proof that engineering, given sufficient freedom and resources, will always outpace the regulatory framework attempting to contain it. The 222D belongs in that company, but with a crucial distinction. Every other car on that list actually competed. They proved their superiority on track, against real opponents, under competitive conditions. The 222D never got that opportunity. Its membership in the pantheon of too-good-to-race machinery is based entirely on specification, reputation, and those 11.4 kilometers of testing that produce data nobody outside Toyota has ever verified. And somehow, paradoxically, that makes its legend stronger rather than weaker. Because the cars that actually raced eventually exposed their limitations. The Chaparral 2J had reliability problems. The Brabham fan car's rear-mounted fan occasionally threw debris at following cars. The Williams FW14B, for all its dominance, still lost races. The 222D has no such record of imperfection. It never had a bad day, never suffered a mechanical failure in competition, never lost to an inferior car on a stage where conditions didn't suit it. Its record is immaculate because its record is empty. There is a theory that circulates among people who think about these things professionally, engineers and designers and team principals who have spent their careers trying to build the fastest possible car within whatever regulatory framework applies, that the 222D represents an inflection point. A moment when the trajectory of rally car development was forcibly redirected by external circumstance. Before the 222D, The trend was toward increasing power, decreasing weight, more exotic materials, more extreme engineering solutions. The logical endpoint of that trend was something like the 222D, or possibly something even more extreme. After the 222D, the trend reversed. Group A regulations prioritized production relevance. Cars got heavier, less powerful, more closely related to what you could buy at a dealership. The regulations deliberately pulled the sport back from the edge that Group B had been dancing on and that Group S would have flung itself over entirely. This wasn't a natural evolution. It was a correction. And the 222D sits right at the apex of the curve, the point of maximum ambition before the pendulum swung back toward sanity. If you want to understand why modern rally cars look and perform the way they do, you need to understand what they're deliberately not. They're not mid-engine. They're not carbon fiber monocoque. They're not producing 600 horsepower from 2 liters. And the reason they're not those things is because someone built a car that was all of those things and the world collectively decided that maybe, just maybe, that was too much. Look, modern rally is incredible. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The current generation of Rally 1 hybrid cars are faster point-to-point than Group B cars ever were. The safety record is incomparably better. The technology is more sophisticated. The competition is closer. By every objective measure, the sport is in a better place than it was in 1986. But something was lost in the correction, and I think even the people who made the right call to cancel Group S would acknowledge that. What was lost was diversity of engineering approach. The freedom for manufacturers to pursue fundamentally different solutions to the same problem and see whose idea was better. In the Group B and Group S era, Toyota could build a mid-engine carbon fiber monocoque rally car while Audi built a front-engine steel-bodied one, and both approaches were valid within the rules. The competition wasn't just between drivers or even between teams. It was between engineering philosophies. Modern regulations, necessarily and wisely, constrain that freedom to a degree that makes the cars more similar to each other than different. Every team runs essentially the same layout with different badges and different liveries. The engineering competition still exists, but it operates within much narrower boundaries. And the 222D represents the road not taken, the future that was possible before the rules changed to prevent it. Sometimes I lie awake at 3 in the morning, which is when all the best and worst automotive thoughts happen, and I wonder what the rally world would look like if Group S had survived. If the 222D had raced and won, and proved that mid-engine all-wheel drive was the superior layout for competition on loose surfaces. Would every manufacturer have followed? Would we have seen an arms race that produced 800 horsepower rally cars by 1990? Would the inevitable tragedy, because at those performance levels on public roads tragedy was not a matter of if but when, have forced an even more dramatic regulatory correction than what actually happened? Or would the technology have advanced safety alongside performance, the way it eventually did in Formula One, producing cars that were simultaneously faster and safer than anything that preceded them? We will never know. And honestly, that might be for the best. Because the alternate timeline where Group S survives is also the timeline where more people probably die. The FIA's decision to cancel the series was made in the immediate aftermath of fatal accidents, informed by the clear understanding that more powerful cars on the same stages with the same crowd control would produce more fatalities, not fewer. The 222D was collateral damage in a decision that almost certainly saved lives. That's a trade that any responsible governing body would make, and should make, even when what's being sacrificed is engineering brilliance of the highest order. But there is something beautiful about the 222D story, isn't there? Not beautiful in the way that a victory is beautiful or a championship or a dominant performance. Beautiful in the way that unfulfilled potential is beautiful. The way that a perfect idea, never tested against reality, retains a kind of purity that actual competition would inevitably have tarnished. The The 222D is motorsport's greatest love letter to ambition. A car built without compromise by people who were told to create the ultimate rally car and who interpreted that brief with absolute literality. No half measures, no cost considerations, no sanity checks, just the purest possible expression of what happens when exceptional engineers are given unlimited resources and a single, clear objective. It's the automotive equivalent of Icarus, except the wings were carbon fiber and Kevlar, the sun was the FIA's legal department, and the ocean it fell into was lined with non-disclosure agreements and corporate secrecy. But unlike Icarus, whose fall is a cautionary tale about hubris, the 222D's story feels more like a cautionary tale about timing. Toyota didn't fly too high. They flew at exactly the right altitude, just at the wrong moment. The destination they were heading toward, extreme performance within a competitive framework, is exactly where motorsport eventually went anyway. It just took 20 more years and several different categories to get there. Every time I see something genuinely special come out of Toyota's Gazoo racing division, every time they push a boundary that convention says shouldn't be pushed, I think about a climate-controlled room in Cologne, Germany. I think about a car that sits silently in that room, waiting for a race that will never come, embodying a level of engineering ambition that its creators were never allowed to fully express. I think about the sound it apparently makes when they fire it up every few years, that howling mechanical fury bouncing off warehouse walls for an audience of maybe 10 people. And I think about the 11.4 kilometers that represent everything we know and everything we don't know about what might have been the greatest rally car ever built. The Toyota 222D remains the most fascinating failure in motorsport history. Not because it failed, but because it never got the chance to succeed. And in a sport defined by results, by tenths of seconds and championship points and podium finishes, there is something profoundly compelling about a car whose legacy is built entirely on potential, on the promise of what could have been, preserved forever in carbon fiber and titanium and magnesium, locked behind a door in Germany that almost nobody has the key to open. That's the thing about the cars that are too good to race. They don't just challenge the regulations. They challenge our assumptions about what matters in motorsport. Is it the result that counts, or the ambition? The trophy, or the engineering? The answer is probably both, but the 222D forces us to consider whether a car can be great without ever proving it. And I think it can. I think the 222D is proof that greatness isn't always measured in wins and losses. Sometimes it's measured in the distance between what was possible and what was permitted. And by that measure, the Toyota 222D might be the greatest race car that ever existed.